Hi, this is Richard Campo from Rose Capital Partners. I'm putting this video together just to talk through some of the key considerations you need to think about when taking out a large loan. So firstly, I'll start with a definition about what that constitutes. Then we'll look at the different types of banks we can use, because again, that's slightly different in this area. And then lastly, the more complex areas around perhaps sort of structuring or income, or the things you probably have to think about specifically in this world as opposed to others. So the first point then around definition. So what is a large loan? So probably borrowing around £1 million or so, I'd say. It does differ from different banks. For example, on the high street, most banks, if you're borrowing above £500,000 or so, that'll put you into their premier underwriting team. So you get more skilled underwriters and maybe a specific point of contact, which you wouldn't necessarily get elsewhere. Once you go above £1 million, then you've got things like private banks that come into the area, and they set things really quite differently. So that's probably the definition of the actual loan amount. There's quite helpfully from the FCA now, there is a definition of a high net worth individual, which is someone who earns £300,000 or more, or has £3 million worth of net assets. So it's sort of self-fulfilling, you're over that £1 million mark in the large loan sector. Now, if you're deemed as a high net worth individual, the affordability rules aren't the same as with other people. You're seen as more financially sophisticated, and therefore you can really push the boundaries. So that will come in a lot more as to sort of what path we go down, which is the next point to think about, is what type of lender to use. So do we go on the high street, or do we go with a private bank? Probably the main difference of the two, I'd suggest, is that if you go to a high street lender, it's a lot cleaner, let's put it that way. They're going to offer you a loan, it's going to be at very competitive terms, typically over a longer sort of structure. So again, just look at the video on home movers or remortgages, because the underlying mortgage is exactly the same. The only difference really will be the actual size of the loan and how it's got to. So on the high street guys, they often bespoke products in this sort of area, so you wouldn't necessarily go and sort of compare the meerkats or anything like that. You know, you'd have to sort of speak to either someone at the bank or typically a broker, and then we can sort of figure out what's the best product to go down. But it's a very nice, straightforward, clean approach, which is typically cheaper. That's the point I'll sort of drive home. If you do want to go to a private bank, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Now, again, that's where that high net worth distinction comes in quite importantly, really, because some banks will only deal with high net worth individuals. That's their sort of bar to entry. Once you do go down the private banking route, at the sort of risk of being slightly disingenuous, if you've ever seen the film Wolf of Wall Street, there's a very famous scene where the guy sits down with the Swiss banker. Now, that is an exaggeration, but equally, it's not a million miles away. So you are playing that game to a degree, is what are you bringing to the bank and what are they bringing to you? So it's not like with a high street, it's very simple, you fit the affordability rules, they give you a mortgage. With a private bank, it's far more about the relationship. And this can be defined in one of two ways as well. So what I'd call high street lending is what we call dry lending. So they simply offer you a mortgage and that's the end of it. With a private bank, often what they'll request is what's called assets under management, or AUM for short. So what banks will say, yeah, no problem, we'll lend you £5 million, but we need £1 million on deposit as well, or invested with them in some form, or you might want to move a pension with them or other assets. It's part of that sort of description. So private banking is far more a relationship-led thing. So they're going to, one, offer you a mortgage because you need it, but then in return, they probably will want some sort of assets or a wider relationship. That is their remit. Now, not all private banks take that approach. Some do dry lending and are quite happy to offer a conventional mortgage to somebody who has no problem whatsoever. But that's sort of really how it differs in terms of how it's approached. Again, high street lending a lot more simple in that you fit the affordability rules, you're offered a mortgage. With private banking, it really is drilled down to things like sector. It can be jurisdiction, it can be nationality. So certain banks like certain things. So that's where the pricing is often quite difficult. It's very, very opaque, if we're honest. So this is where brokers add phenomenal value. We have years and years of experience of placing different clients with different banks. And just because you walk in the door of a private bank, say, yeah, we start lending at this margin, doesn't necessarily mean that's what you'll get. It's, again, to use a really cheesy analogy, it's like the EasyJet thing. You know, you sort of see, fly to so-and-so for £99. But by the time you factor in the fact you want to leave at a sort of sensible time in the day and actually go to an airport vaguely close where you want to go to, the ticket price is then $250. Same thing in the private banking world. It's pricing from. That doesn't mean it's necessarily what you'll get. So that is very much how a broker adds a lot of value in understanding what bank to go to at the outset, holding the terms that you should be offered, and then even negotiating that down as well, because there's often room to maneuver. So that's where the AUM conversation comes in as well. So it might be a case of, okay, we'll offer you a certain margin if you then sort of just do the dry lend, but then it'll come down quite considerably if you put assets with the bank. Now that's a very personal decision, and we're just here to guide you as to what's best for you. So if you decide that actually, yes, you do want to place some assets with that bank to get cheaper lending, or it just suits you generally, fantastic. If you don't want to do that, great. We're here to sort of pick the path that's going to suit you best. Now, next to that will really be then the assessment of income. I've already touched on the high net worth proposition there. So you principally have to sort of be in that world, but due to that, normally incomes are more complex. You deal with a lot more self-employed people, a lot of people with far more complicated structures to their income. So, for example, they might have carried interest in other businesses, they might have vesting stock schedules, they might have income from other assets, or even different countries. So that does become a lot more complicated, and therefore the assessment can be a lot more difficult. Again, it's really our role as a broker to sort of pick through all of that to then say, can we prove affordability? So not in a conventional sense, but can you actually afford the loan? Or can we place assets to mitigate the risk? So it's what some banks will do, is if there isn't a very clear income stream, they'll say, well, actually, we want 2 to 5 years worth of interest placed on deposit with us, and then we will grant you a loan. So you can go down that path as well when you have more assets, more income to play with. Next then probably, I think, is structuring. I think is probably relevant at this point as well. So again, quite specifically in the high net worth world, and less so these days, but it still is a thing where you might want to buy the company through a company that's then maybe backed up by a trust, or that might be a situation you've inherited, or a path you want to go down for wider tax purposes. Now again, that second you sort of talk about structuring, that pretty much just wipes out most of the high street guys. They're just not interested in structuring. They just want to lend to the individual and keep it simple. Again, private banks are far more open to that. What they'll want to understand is something called the UBO, the ultimate beneficial owner. So who's the person behind the structure? Do they have permission to do what they want to do? And if the bank needs to, can they get recourse from that individual? Or are they comfortable lending at that level? So again, a lot more complicated in terms of structure and income, but there's certainly things that you do want to think about. Probably last then in the sort of the large loan area I'll think about is something called cross-charging. So this is something, again, quite specific to this world. Very, very rarely happens elsewhere with this. So let's take a really simple example just for the sake of this math. So let's say, for example, you own a £5 million property with a £1 million mortgage, and then you want to buy a second property for £5 million. Now, in a traditional sense, what you'd have to do is raise a mortgage against the property and then put that as a deposit on another, or liquidate other assets and do it that way. What a private bank might want to do is then cross-charge the asset. So they'll say, well, okay, fine, you've already got this property, no worries, we'll take over the mortgage there. We'll then put a charge on the second property, and then we'll raise all the money for you for the purchase. So effectively, you're doing 100% purchase on the second property. Because the way the bank will look at it is go, well, actually, here we've got £10 million worth of assets, £6 million worth of debt, therefore we're quite happy to lend. So cross-charging, you can do that on property, you can do that on other assets, listed stocks. Again, sort of lots of ways you can achieve that. And again, that's sort of something quite specific to this sector. As I touched on before, the underlying mortgage does follow the same principles which I've covered in other areas, so please do look at probably the home buyer video, probably a good one to look at as to how that mortgage can be approached. But they're probably some of the more specific things you need to think about when approaching a large loan, and even more specifically, how brokers are really, really helpful in going down the right course at the outset, because there's nothing worse than going all the way down with the bank, having multiple meetings, have endless amounts of information put together just at the last minute for that to fall apart because the pricing isn't what you wanted, or something sort of kicked around in your past. You just don't want that. So if we can deal with it all at the front end, makes that back end go smoother, then you can achieve what you want to achieve.